James sat at the back of the lecture hall, his eyes focused on the whiteboard as Dr. Thompson, the calculus professor, scribbled formulas and equations with precise, almost mechanical motions. It was a usual Wednesday morning, but for James, it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. The class was tough, perhaps one of the toughest he'd ever taken, and every day felt like a battle to keep up. But despite the pressure, James had never let his confidence waver. He had always loved math, from the first time he'd cracked open a textbook in high school to the long nights he spent solving equations just for fun. He wasn't intimidated by the complexities of calculus, not in the slightest. Yet, as Dr. Thompson's voice echoed through the room, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched differently from the rest of the students. Dr. Thompson had a reputation. He was strict, a bit distant, and sometimes, his lectures felt more like a test of endurance than an opportunity to learn. But there was something else too, something more subtle, yet sharp. Dr. Thompson, perhaps unknowingly, carried an air of doubt when he looked at James. James could feel it, even though the professor never said anything outright. It was in the way his eyes sometimes flicked toward him when asking questions, as though expecting James to stumble. "All right, let's move on to the next topic," Dr. Thompson said, breaking the silence. "This is where many of you start to get lost. Don't let the notation fool you, it's not as complicated as it looks." James shifted slightly in his seat. He had already completed the problems they were about to discuss in his own time, and the solution seemed so clear in his mind. The whole class was struggling to keep up, but James was already ahead, confident in his understanding. He raised his hand, hoping to contribute his solution to the problem. It wasn't that he wanted to show off, but he genuinely enjoyed helping others and sharing the beauty of solving problems. Dr. Thompson paused, his gaze flicking over the class. He spotted James's raised hand and, without hesitation, pointed directly at him. "Yes, James," the professor asked, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. The days following the exam felt strange for James. He had gotten an A, a perfect score, no less, and yet the feeling of triumph was bittersweet. While his classmates were congratulating him, and some of them even asked for his help with upcoming material, James couldn't shake the sense that something was still unsettled. Dr. Thompson had handed back the exams with his usual calm demeanor, but there was something in the way he had the weeks after the conversation with Dr. Thompson felt different. James no longer carried that same heavy feeling of being underestimated. Although the professor's words hadn't been the grand apology he'd secretly hoped for, they were enough. There was a shift in the way James viewed himself in that class. For the first time, he felt like he belonged. It was like a door had opened, not just in the classroom, but in his mind. He realized that his worth was not defined by anyone else's perception of him. He didn't need Dr. Thompson's approval to know that he was capable. The class had continued as usual, with Dr. Thompson still presenting his usual lectures, but there was a new respect in the air. James could sense that Dr. Thompson was being more mindful of his approach, and although he didn't treat James like a special case, the professor's tone had softened. There were no more sarcastic comments or dismissals. Instead, there was a subtle acknowledgement that James had earned his place in the class, not by conforming to Dr. Thompson's methods, but by thinking critically and solving problems in his own way. As the semester drew to a close, James found himself helping his classmates more and more. The students who had once looked at him with curiosity and even doubt now sought him out for advice. It was a strange feeling, but it was one that James welcomed. He wasn't interested in proving anything anymore. He was simply sharing what he had learned, helping others see the beauty of math the way he saw it. He even started tutoring some of his classmates outside of class, offering them guidance on the problems that had once seemed insurmountable to them. It was a quiet kind of victory for him, knowing that he had succeeded, and now he was helping others succeed as well. One day, as James was walking out of class, Dr. Thompson stopped him again. This time, the professor wasn't standing behind his desk or flipping through papers. He was standing by the door, waiting for James as he gathered his things. The way Dr. Thompson looked at him, with a small smile on his face, made James pause. "James," Dr. Thompson said, his voice steady but with a new warmth. "I've been meaning to ask you something." James turned to face him. He wasn't sure what this conversation would be about, but after everything that had happened, he was more than willing to listen. "Sure, Dr. Thompson," James replied. "I've noticed how much you've helped your classmates," the professor began. "And I wanted to say that I've been impressed with the way you've taken charge of your learning. You've really grown this semester. I just wanted to acknowledge that." James blinked, surprised. He had expected Dr. Thompson to talk about his performance on the final exam or maybe his improvement in the class, but hearing those words felt different. The professor wasn't just acknowledging his academic success, he was recognizing the way James had navigated through the challenges, the way he had remained true to himself despite the obstacles. "Thank you, Dr. Thompson," James said softly, not quite knowing how to respond. "That means a lot to me." The professor nodded. "You know, James, I've taught a lot of students over the years. But you're one of the few who have made me rethink my approach. I've learned a lot from you this semester, and I won't forget that." James felt a warmth spread through him. For so long, he had been waiting for someone to acknowledge him, to see him as more than just a student trying to keep up. And now, here was Dr. Thompson, the same professor who had doubted him from the very start, standing in front of him and saying the words he had never expected to hear. "You've got a real gift for math, James," Dr. Thompson continued. "And you've got the kind of mindset that can take you far, not just in this subject, but in whatever you choose to do. I hope you continue to push yourself." James smiled, feeling a sense of pride that he had never fully experienced before. "I will, Dr. Thompson. Thank you for everything." As he walked out of the classroom that day, James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The road to this point hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He had fought for his place in that class, and he had earned it. More than that, he had proven something to himself, that he was capable, that he was intelligent, and that his worth wasn't determined by the opinions of others. It was something he had always known deep down, but it had taken a long time to truly believe it. The rest of the semester passed by quickly. As the final exams came to an end, James found himself reflecting on everything he had learned, not just about calculus, but about himself. He had grown, not just as a student, but as a person. He had faced challenges head-on, and he had come out stronger for it. Dr. Thompson's apology, though not in the form James had imagined, had been exactly what he needed. It wasn't just an admission of being wrong. It was an acknowledgement of James's abilities, and it showed that even the most skeptical of people could learn to appreciate someone for who they truly were. As James left the classroom for the final time that semester, he realized that it wasn't just about the grade he had received, or the way Dr. Thompson had finally seen him. It was about how he had seen himself all along. James had never needed anyone's approval, especially not from someone who doubted him. He had always known that he was capable of greatness. All he had needed was the courage to prove it. And now, standing in the hallway with the weight of the semester behind him, James knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead was his to shape, and no one would ever be able to take that from him. D looked at James that day, something that James couldn't quite place. James had always been aware of how people viewed him. It was as if his success in math was a surprise to others, a rarity to be marveled at, rather than expected. But this time, it felt different. He had always known he was capable, but Dr. Thompson had never seen him that way. No matter how hard James tried to prove himself in class, Dr. Thompson always seemed to look down on him, as if James's abilities didn't match his expectations. It was frustrating, but James had learned to handle it. What bothered him more now was how Dr. Thompson seemed to recognize his excellence, yet still remained silent, as if acknowledging it would somehow undermine his own authority. The following week, Dr. Thompson asked for a private meeting with James after class. The professor had emailed him earlier in the day, requesting a time to talk, but James wasn't sure what to expect. He had imagined this moment before, imagined the professor finally acknowledging his intelligence, perhaps apologizing for the constant dismissals. But as James walked to the professor's office after class, those hopeful thoughts began to fade. What if Dr. Thompson still couldn't see him for what he was? What if this was just another attempt to put James in his place? When James arrived at Dr. Thompson's office, the door was slightly ajar. He knocked softly and stepped inside. The professor was seated behind a cluttered desk, flipping through papers. He glanced up when James entered, his face briefly softening before returning to his usual, impassive expression. "James," Dr. Thompson said, gesturing for him to sit. "Please, take a seat." James sat down, trying to remain composed. He didn't know what to expect, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. Dr. Thompson had spent the entire semester questioning his abilities, and now James was supposed to be convinced that the professor had suddenly changed his mind. "I just wanted to have a word about your performance on the exam," Dr. Thompson continued, looking at the papers in front of him. "You did exceptionally well. I have to admit, I wasn't expecting that." James nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He had heard this before, that same, careful acknowledgement of his abilities, wrapped in an air of surprise. It wasn't praise. It wasn't respect. It was more like a reluctant admission that James had outperformed expectations, even when those expectations were low. "I know I've been hard on you in class," Dr. Thompson said, his voice lower now, almost apologetic. "And I'm sorry if I made you feel like you didn't belong. But I want to be clear, I never doubted your potential." James's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. But as the words left Dr. Thompson's mouth, James wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or frustrated. The professor was apologizing, but it felt like he was still hedging his words, still unwilling to fully admit that he had been wrong. "You see, James," Dr. Thompson continued, "you've always had the ability to excel in this subject. But you weren't following the methods I taught you. And that's why I pushed you. I wanted to make sure you could handle the material in the way I knew would prepare you for the real world." James's brows furrowed slightly. "So, you were pushing me because you thought I wasn't following the right methods?" Dr. Thompson nodded slowly. "Yes. I thought I was helping you. But I realize now that my approach wasn't the best for you. You have a different way of thinking about math. You're more intuitive than I gave you credit for." It was strange hearing those words from Dr. Thompson, but something about the way he said it felt genuine. It was as if, for the first time, the professor was seeing James as someone with real potential, not just as a student he had to shape into his own image of success. "I appreciate you saying that, Dr. Thompson," James replied, his voice steady. "But I have to be honest. I've been working hard, and I've always been confident in my abilities. I didn't need to follow your methods to do well. But I understand now that you were trying to help, in your own way." Dr. Thompson gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I should have recognized that earlier. It's just hard to see sometimes, you know. We professors get so wrapped up in what we think works that we forget to look at our students as individuals. I didn't see your strengths the way I should have." James sat back in his chair, considering the professor's words. For the first time, Dr. Thompson wasn't talking down to him. He wasn't questioning his abilities or dismissing his work. He was simply acknowledging the truth, that James had succeeded on his own terms, and that he didn't need to fit into the mold that the professor had expected. It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense, but it was as close as Dr. Thompson was going to get. I think we both learned something this semester, Dr. Thompson said, breaking the silence. You've taught me to be more open-minded, and I've learned not to underestimate you. I won't make that mistake again. James nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't the dramatic apology he had imagined, but it was enough. For the first time in months, he felt like he had been seen, truly seen, for who he was, a capable, intelligent student who had refused to let anyone's expectations define him. Thank you, Dr. Thompson, James said, standing up to leave. I appreciate your honesty. As he walked out of the professor's office, James felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had proven his worth, not just to himself, but to the person who had once doubted him the most. And that, James realized, was all that mattered. The weeks passed, and the tension in the calculus class continued to build. James tried his best to ignore Dr. Thompson's sharp glances and the subtle way he undermined him in front of the class. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that the professor had it out for him. The rest of the class seemed to be in the same boat, struggling with the material, but they weren't the ones who were singled out. It was James who always seemed to get the hardest questions, the sarcastic comments, and the diss of the day of the final exam arrived, and the entire class was on edge. The weight of the semester's work, the pressure to perform, and the growing uncertainty about how Dr. Thompson would judge them all hung in the air like a thick fog. James could feel it, too. The tension in the classroom was palpable. Students whispered nervously about the professor's reputation for making the exams impossible, and some of them expressed their concerns about failing. It was as if everyone had already accepted that they were doomed. James, however, wasn't worried. He had been preparing for this moment for months. While his classmates crammed the night before, fretting over the material they didn't quite understand, James had already mastered the concepts. His notes were meticulous, filled with detailed explanations and solved problems, each more complex than the last. He had tackled the hardest questions and found his own ways to solve them. Calculus, for James, was no longer just a subject, it was a language he understood fluently. Despite his confidence, there was still that nagging feeling that Dr. Thompson would somehow find a way to dismiss his abilities. The professor had been so determined to make James feel inadequate that James couldn't help but wonder if he was in for another round of public humiliation. Would Dr. Thompson dismiss his work again? Would the professor find fault with his answers, no matter how correct they were? The thought made James uneasy, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to let the professor's opinions affect him any longer. He had to focus on the test. As the class filed in one by one, Dr. Thompson stood at the front of the room, his stern expression as unreadable as ever. He handed out the exam papers, his eyes sweeping over the class with a quick glance. When the papers landed on James's desk, James took a deep breath and focused. This was it. There would be no more doubts, no more questions. He would prove to himself and to everyone else that he was more than capable of handling the challenge. The test was long, filled with intricate problems that required a deep understanding of the material. But as James worked through each problem, he felt a sense of calm. The questions, which would have stumped most students, were familiar to him. He breezed through the integration problems, the differential equations, and the tricky limits that Dr. Thompson had made seem so complicated. James had already solved these types of problems in his own time, applying his own methods and strategies. As he worked, he could almost hear Dr. Thompson's voice in his head, doubtfully questioning his every move. But this time, James wasn't worried. He knew what he was doing. It wasn't long before the clock ticked down, and there were only a few minutes left. James looked over his work, checking each solution carefully. He had been thorough, not rushing through the problems but making sure every answer was accurate. Satisfied, he set his pen down and took a moment to breathe. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the exam, the class let out a collective sigh of relief. Some students rushed to hand in their papers, eager to escape the stress of the test, while others sat back in their chairs, still unsure of how they had done. James stood up and walked toward Dr. Thompson's desk, his paper in hand. As he placed the test on the desk, Dr. Thompson glanced at him, his eyes briefly meeting James's. There was no smile, no acknowledgement of the effort James had put into the exam. Just the same unreadable expression. "Thank you, James," Dr. Thompson said, almost dismissively, before turning his attention to the next student. James walked back to his seat, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had done his best, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Thompson wouldn't see it that way. The professor had already made up his mind about James, and no matter what the test results showed, James wasn't sure if that would ever change. The days following the exam were a blur. James kept to himself, focusing on his studies and avoiding the anxious chatter that seemed to fill the halls. He knew that the results of the test would be posted soon, but he didn't allow himself to dwell on them. He had done what he could, and now it was out of his hands. When the grades were finally posted, James made his way to the board, the familiar nervousness creeping in. He knew he had done well. In fact, he was certain he had done better than most of the class, but he still feared how Dr. Thompson would react. Would the professor even acknowledge his hard work, or would he simply dismiss it? James's heart raced as his eyes scanned the list of grades. His name was at the top of the list, marked with a large, bold A. His hands shook slightly as he read the grade again, just to make sure he hadn't misread it. A perfect score. He had done it. He had outperformed everyone in the class, and despite Dr. Thompson's doubts and dismissal, James had come out on top. But as the other students gathered around the board, discussing their grades and the outcome of the exam, James couldn't shake the feeling that this victory was still incomplete. He had proven himself to the class, but the real test, he realized, was whether he could prove himself to Dr. Thompson. He had passed the exam, but that wasn't enough. He needed the professor to see him for who he really was, a math genius who had been underestimated, ignored, and dismissed for far too long. The next day, Dr. Thompson handed back the exams. As he made his way around the room, he paused when he reached James's desk. He didn't say anything, but he handed the test back with a nod of his head. James accepted the paper, but he could feel the professor's gaze on him. There was something different this time, something James couldn't quite place. For the first time, Dr. Thompson seemed to hesitate, as if he was unsure of how to approach James. But before James could say anything, Dr. Thompson quickly moved on to the next student, leaving James to sit with the quiet recognition of his victory. As the class continued, James felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had proven his worth, not just to himself, but to everyone who had doubted him. But it wasn't just the grade that mattered. It was the fact that James had taken control of his own success, despite the obstacles that had been placed in his way. James knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more challenges to face. But for now, he could take pride in knowing that he had shown his true potential. And as for Dr. Thompson, maybe it was time for the professor to realize that James was not just another student, he was someone who would not be overlooked, no matter what. Proving stares. James kept his head down, focusing on his work. His notebook was filled with detailed solutions to the problems Dr. Thompson assigned, but none of it seemed to matter. The professor's expectations were so high that even when James solved a problem in a way no one else could, it was still dismissed. He had never been one to boast or demand attention, but he couldn't understand why his hard work seemed to go unnoticed. He had done everything right. He studied, he worked through the problems, he even helped others when they asked, yet nothing ever seemed good enough for Dr. Thompson. One afternoon, as James walked into class, he noticed the usual nervous chatter among the students. The upcoming exam was weighing heavily on everyone, but James wasn't worried. He had already gone through every problem that Dr. Thompson had assigned, and he knew the material inside and out. He just didn't know how to shake the feeling that his knowledge wouldn't be enough to impress his professor. As he sat down in his seat, he overheard a conversation between a couple of his classmates. They were talking about the exam, but it was clear that their focus was not on the material. Instead, they were concerned about what Dr. Thompson might say if they didn't do well. "I heard he's going to make an example of someone this time," one of the students said, her voice low. "It's like he's waiting for one of us to mess up so he can make a big deal out of it." "Yeah, I bet James is next," the other student said with a hint of a laugh. "I don't know why he tries so hard. The professor clearly doesn't like him." James felt a sharp pain in his chest, but he didn't show it. He had heard similar things before. He had known that some of the other students were watching him, judging him, and making assumptions about his abilities. It was a part of life he had learned to deal with. People often didn't expect much from him, and even when he worked hard, it seemed like it wasn't enough. The lecture began, and Dr. Thompson started discussing advanced integration techniques. It was a topic that James had already mastered, but as usual, Dr. Thompson was quick to point out the students who were falling behind. The professor's voice echoed in the classroom, but James didn't let it distract him. He pulled out his notebook and began to take notes, silently going over the material in his head. When it was time for questions, James raised his hand. He had a solution to one of the problems they were discussing, one that he had worked out on his own the night before. But as soon as Dr. Thompson saw him raise his hand, a small, almost imperceptible smirk appeared on his face. "Yes, James," Dr. Thompson said, his voice cold, as if he were already expecting James to make a mistake. James stood up and calmly explained his solution. He could tell by the professor's expression that Dr. Thompson was expecting him to stumble over his words or fail to explain the process clearly. But James wasn't nervous. He had done this hundreds of times before, and he knew the material better than anyone in the class. As he walked through the steps of his solution, Dr. Thompson interrupted. That's interesting," he said, his tone dripping with doubt. "But I believe you're missing a crucial step. The method you're suggesting is fine for simple problems, but it's not the approach we're using here. Let's try it my way, shall we?" James felt his heart race, but he didn't let it show. He had expected this. It was becoming a pattern now. No matter what he said or did, Dr. Thompson would always find a reason to dismiss his methods. The other students in the class shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension in the air, but none of them said anything. James turned to the board, wiped away the equations he had written, and stepped aside to let the professor show them what he wanted. Dr. Thompson began to explain his method, and James quietly stood off to the side, waiting for the professor to finish. As he listened, he couldn't help but feel that the approach Dr. Thompson was using was unnecessarily complicated. James had always prided himself on finding the simplest solution, the one that didn't require any extra steps. But here, in this classroom, that wasn't enough. The professor's method was long and drawn out, and James could see the frustration beginning to build in the other students. They were starting to fall behind, confused by the complex steps Dr. Thompson was outlining. But instead of helping, the professor seemed to enjoy the confusion. He reveled in the challenge, as if he were proving a point about the difficulty of the material. When Dr. Thompson finally finished, he turned back to the class. "Now, does everyone understand the method I've explained?" he asked, scanning the room with a critical eye. "I'm sure James could probably explain it better than the rest of you, but I doubt he's been able to fully grasp the complexity of this topic. Not everyone can think outside the box." James felt a sting in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He had heard it all before. He had worked hard to understand this material, and he didn't need validation from anyone, especially not from someone who refused to see his abilities. After class, James stayed behind as the students filed out. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for what he knew was coming. Dr. Thompson had been watching him the entire time, waiting for him to fail. "James," Dr. Thompson said, his voice quieter now. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" James turned to face him. "Sure, Dr. Thompson." The professor glanced around to make sure no one else was lingering. "Look, I've been watching you for a while," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "You've been getting by, but I have to be honest with you. You're not going to succeed in this class if you keep ignoring the proper methods. I'm trying to help you, but you need to understand that there's a way to approach this material, and you're not following it." James felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He had been following the material in his own way. He had been doing the work, understanding the problems, and solving them. But Dr. Thompson couldn't see it. All he saw was a student who didn't fit his mold. "I understand, Dr. Thompson," James said, his voice steady. "I just think that there's more than one way to solve these problems." The professor shook his head. "There's only one right way, James. Trust me, I know what I'm talking about." As the professor walked away, James stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. He wasn't sure if he should be angry or just resigned. It felt like no matter what he did, he would never be good enough for Dr. Thompson. But one thing was certain, James wasn't about to let anyone make him doubt his abilities. James stood up, making sure to speak clearly. "I think the solution to this problem involves simplifying the integral and then applying a basic substitution method." There was a moment of silence as Dr. Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't the answer he had been expecting, but James's response seemed solid. The professor, however, was quick to deflect. "Well," Dr. Thompson said, almost too quickly, "that's one way to look at it, but I'm sure you're not familiar with the full method. Let me show you the correct procedure." James's face flushed slightly, not from embarrassment, but from the realization that Dr. Thompson had dismissed his answer so quickly. He sat back down, a knot tightening in his stomach. It wasn't the first time he had felt this way in class, but for some reason, it stung more today. His solution had been simple and effective, yet the professor's words implied doubt. As Dr. Thompson continued to explain the correct method, James couldn't help but feel a growing frustration. The method Dr. Thompson was teaching was more complicated than necessary, and James had already solved the problem using a simpler approach. But he didn't want to disrupt the class or challenge the professor. So, he kept quiet, watching as the lecture continued. The other students around him, who struggled with the material, were fixated on Dr. Thompson's every word. But James couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just another student in this class. It was as if Dr. Thompson's focus was constantly on him, waiting for him to slip up. It felt like a subtle form of pressure that James didn't fully understand. After the lecture, the class moved to the hallway where students gathered in small groups to discuss the lesson. James hung back, unsure of how to interact. He didn't quite fit in with the others. His classmates were friendly enough, but he often felt like an outsider in this advanced course, not because of his race, but because of the unspoken expectations that seemed to hang over him. "Hey, James, what did you think about the lecture today?" a classmate, Kathy, asked as she passed by. Kathy was a friendly, outgoing student, and she often partnered with James for study sessions. "It was all right," James said with a shrug. "The professor's methods are a bit more complicated than they need to be." Kathy laughed. "Tell me about it." "I'm just trying to keep up." "You seem to get it, though." James smiled, though he wasn't quite sure what to say. He didn't want to seem like he was bragging, but it was true the material came easily to him. He had already grasped most of the concepts they were studying in high school. He'd always been a step ahead in math, and that wasn't an accident. His mother had always told him, "Keep learning, James. Don't let anyone tell you you're not good enough. But here, in this class, it felt like Dr. Thompson might be trying to prove something. James could sense that the professor viewed him as just another student who would likely fail to meet the high standards set by the course. He didn't know how to shake that feeling. Maybe it was all in his head, but he didn't think so. The next day, Dr. Thompson asked the class to submit their homework in a new way, requiring students to come up to the front of the class and present their solutions on the whiteboard. James didn't mind doing this. He enjoyed the challenge, and presenting his solutions out loud helped him better understand the material. But as he stood at the front, marker in hand, he couldn't help but notice Dr. Thompson's sharp gaze, watching his every move. "Let's see what you've got, James," Dr. Thompson said, the words casual but carrying an undertone of expectation. James went through the steps of his solution, explaining his approach clearly. He noticed a few students behind him glancing at the board, probably trying to figure out how he was solving the problem. As he finished, he turned to the class, ready to accept any questions. But before anyone could speak, Dr. Thompson interjected. "That's a very interesting method, James," Dr. Thompson said, his voice flat, "but it's not quite the approach I expected. Let's stick to the standard procedure next time, all right?" James nodded, though he felt a pang of disappointment. He had put in the effort to understand the problem, to solve it in a way that made sense to him. But Dr. Thompson's tone, though not overtly harsh, implied that James wasn't quite measuring up. There was a subtle edge to the professor's words, as though he expected James to fail despite his clear understanding. As James returned to his seat, he felt a sense of alienation creeping over him. He was used to being the quiet student, the one who got things done and didn't seek attention. But here, in Dr. Thompson's class, it felt like his silence was misinterpreted as ignorance. And that hurt. But James wasn't the type to back down. He had come too far to let one professor's judgment hold him back. As the days passed, he made a silent vow to prove to himself, and to Dr. Thompson, that he belonged in this class just as much as anyone else. The journey wouldn't be easy, but James was ready. He knew his worth. He just needed to find a way to show everyone else.